Okay, everyone, today we are learning about some of the practical knowledge and information that you need to have to glaze a finished piece of ceramics that has been through its first fire. So this is Bisqueware. I've already put 2 layers of glaze on it, and we're gonna be doing the 3rd layer together. So before we start that, there's some things that you need to know about glaze, okay? First of all, glaze needs to have 3 layers to get a solid color. Okay, and so what that means is you do 1 layer, you paint 1 layer in one direction. So say I did this one horizontal. I'm gonna let it dry completely, like to the next day usually, or at least 4 hours. Okay, then I'm gonna paint the 2nd layer in another direction, and I will let it dry completely, and then I paint a 3rd layer in a completely different direction. So what this does is it prevents brush strokes from showing, and it gives me a solid layer of color. Now, an important thing to understand is glaze is never, almost ever, the color it's going to be coming out of the container of glaze compared to what it's going to look like when it's finished. And so there are test tiles for every glaze that we have, and so you want to look at the test tiles. If you can't find a test tile, you can Google the brand, number, and name of the glaze. Okay, and that will show you what the glaze is going to look like. Now, glaze is going through a chemical reaction in the kiln, and so what this means is it's going to completely change. Also, glaze is not paint. If you mix glaze together, like 2 different colors of glaze together, it's always doing a crazy science experiment, and it doesn't have predictable results. So unless you have tested it and fired test tiles of your mixed glazes together, you never really know what they're actually going to look like when they come out of the kiln. And so keep that in mind. If you're mixing glazes, it may come out something like amazing and beautiful. It may be something ugly and mucky and sleazy looking. You never know. And so if you're going to be mixing glaze colors together, just you're rolling the dice, and you have to expect that. Okay, next, we don't want any glaze on the bottom of the piece. Anywhere the piece sits on the table, if there's glaze there, what happens is as you fire that piece in the kiln, the glaze turns into molten glass, and it will permanently bond with the kiln shelf, and you will have to break your piece to get it off the kiln shelf. And so you want to never have glaze on the bottom of your piece. Okay, this is a permanent connection once it's fired, and you can't get it off. Okay, if you do more than 3 layers of glaze, especially towards the bottom part of any vessel where it sits on the shelf, it's going to run like water as it's firing. It turns into molten glass. It's a liquid. And so if it runs down, you're going to end up with big drips on the bottom, or you're going to end with it permanently bonded to the shelf. So 3 layers of glaze is the maximum, no matter what you can do. So that being said, before I start, I like to go back to my thumbnail drawings, and I like to draw out my color scheme on my original thumbnails that I did. Okay, and so I've already figured out that on this I'm going to do saturation gold on the outside, and the inside is going to be a different color. So anytime you're using glaze, you only want to get 1 color on your palette. Okay, because glaze is expensive. Any glaze that we don't use, we're going to be returning back to the container. So here's our containers. When you're getting glaze, glaze settles. So you're going to want to hold it with your finger over the top. You're going to hold the screw top lid, and you're going to gently shake it so that any of the stuff settled on the bottom is mixed up really nicely. We don't want it to splatter anywhere, so I'm going to hold this tight while I'm doing it. Okay, now the other thing is, once you open the container, you're going to look and see, is it open? Can I squeeze it and have air come out? If you don't, you're gonna take a paper clip and you're gonna poke it down in there, okay? If you squeeze hard on a clogged glaze nozzle, what's gonna happen is this whole lid will come off and you will spray glaze everywhere, okay? So you wanna make sure that if it is clogged, that you unclog it and don't squeeze the bottle hard, because it will burst off and make a horrible mess and waste all kinds of glaze, okay? So I have my piece. I've taken it off the rack, and I have a piece of paper towel down. Okay, I always want to put a piece of paper towel down. Okay, glaze makes a big mess, and so I want to make sure that it's easy for me to clean up. Okay, so we're gonna move ahead for a second and go to cleaning up, okay, because I want you to see what that looks like. So I have 2 layers of glaze on here, and I can see I have a couple little mistakes that I made as I was painting my glaze. So instead of just painting over it, I have to get those mistakes off there. Now, it's important to remember glaze is not paint. So if I cover this with another layer, what's going to happen is the glaze, as it melts, will mix together with the underneath layers and do unpredictable things and potentially messy things. So there's a couple different ways to clean it up. Okay, one of those ways is I can get in here with a wet sponge and I can wipe it off. Okay, but you can see that takes off all my layers of glaze, right? So that is my clay showing back through. So another way that you can clean it up that I actually prefer is to get a tool and scrape it off. Okay, so I have a lot more control scraping, and we can get through to all the layers that I want to take off. Now, glaze has the same minerals in it that clay does, and so we know we want to not inhale a lot of it, okay? So we want to be cognizant of that while you're cleaning off your clay, that you are paying attention, your glaze, that you're paying attention to what you're doing with the glaze itself, okay? So any mistakes that you make, you have to clean up before you go on to the next thing, okay? The other thing is, we don't want any glaze on the bottom. You can see this has an uneven edge. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna get in here with the sponge and I'm going to wash that glaze off. And I'm gonna need to do it a couple of times. And this is a black glaze, so it's kind of dramatic, okay? But you're going to want to rehydrate that glaze, wipe it off so that there's no glaze on the bottom of your piece, because you don't want it permanently stuck to the kiln shelf. Now, I have my signature stamp on there, and you can see some of the glaze got into that, okay? And so I'll even need to make sure that part's cleaned out, okay? So that's what you're gonna do for tidying up, okay? Now, back to applying the actual glaze itself. So I have my ceramic piece. I want to paint my third layer of glaze on here so I can get it ready for firing. So I've done one layer horizontally, one layer vertically, and so my next layer I'm going to do diagonally, okay? And I'm going to go across like this with my glaze, and I like to do a patting motion, pat, 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 because I have a lot of texture on this particular mug. And so if I want to get my glaze down into that area, I need a pat so that it is flowing down into those areas. I'm going to be nice and solid just the way I want it to look. So I'm patting it down in so that it's going to really be on there, nice and solid how I want it. Okay, so one layer horizontal, one layer vertical, one layer diagonal. Okay, and you have to let it dry completely between each layer. What happens if you don't is that you end up with too thick of an area, and as the glaze contracts and starts getting hard, it's gonna pop right off your piece. And then you will end up with missing glaze patches in areas that you want to have glaze. Okay, so I'm doing diagonal, but I'm also doing a patting motion. And so that's how I'm gonna do it. Now, if you have areas where you're filling in one specific color of glaze, what you wanna do is get a little tiny brush, okay? Any messy stuff you do with your glaze is gonna look just as messy when it comes out of the kiln, okay? So I would do my entire layer with the glaze that I am using, and I'm not gonna put my fingers on this, okay? So I can only paint half of this at a time. I'm gonna let it sit and dry, and then I'll paint the other half as soon as it is dry so that it's ready to go in the kiln with everything completely dry. And I'm gonna do this with all of my parts. After I am done glazing, I need to take my brush, wash it out completely. I need to take any leftover glaze and put it back in the container that it came from so that I'm not wasting anything. Glaze is very expensive. We want to make sure that we are not being casual with our use of it, and that it is fully being managed and taken care of and going back in the container it came out of without any waste, which is one of the reasons we only get one color of glaze at a time. Okay, if you get multiple colors of glaze, it's really easy for them to get mucked together and then not be able to be used by anyone else and wasted. Okay, so you want to be really aware of that and really careful about it so that we're not wasting any glaze. Okay, 3 nice good layers. Letting it dry between each layer is the way to go. Okay, So glaze is pretty straightforward. Now, once your glaze is done, you're gonna need to use a glaze ticket and fill it out. And you can see name, class period, date, the name of this project. So this would be my slab mug. It's gonna be project number 2 for my free choice projects. How many layers of glaze are in each area? Should always be 3. Is your base clean? Yes, it has to be cleaned. Do you have any exposed bisque clay? No, you wanna cover your whole piece in glaze except the very bottom. Okay, all edges need to be tidy. And do I have my cookie underneath it? And we have seen how to roll a cookie, and your cookie needs to go underneath while you fire it. Okay, and so this is what you need to do to be ready to have your piece glaze fired. Okay, so I have my piece, and this is damp, so I'm not gonna move it until this side dries because I want my glaze to stay on there. I want it to look good and be really clean with nice edges. And so that's our basic for glazing. Okay, make sure you wash all your tools thoroughly. You have to wash off your palette, put everything away just how you found it. All right, so that's how we do glaze. Pretty straightforward.